In the mists of history, where the line between myth and reality blurs into shadow, there exists a group of figures as enigmatic as the ancient stones and tangled forests they called home. They are the priests of ancient Britain, the keepers of sacred knowledge, the judges of kings, and the specters at the edge of Roman nightmares. They are the Druids. For centuries, their name has echoed through time, conjuring images of white-robed figures in moonlit groves, of mystical rites at Stonehenge, and of arcane wisdom lost to the world. But who were they, really? They left behind no grand temples inscribed with their doctrines, no holy books detailing their beliefs. Theirs was a world of the spoken word, of knowledge committed to memory, a sacred trust designed to be shielded from the uninitiated. What we know of them is a mosaic pieced together from the often biased accounts of their conquerors, the myths of their descendants, and the silent testimony of the earth itself. They were a people deliberately shrouded in secrecy, and their story is one we must excavate, layer by painstaking layer. Join us as we part the veil of time and venture into the world of the ancient British priests. This is Driftwood Histories, and tonight, we are unveiling the secrets of the Druids. To seek the Druids is to embark on a most peculiar kind of quest. Imagine, for a moment, trying to understand the deepest philosophies of Plato, the laws of Moses, or the teachings of the Buddha, but with one absolute, inviolable rule. Not a single word of it was ever written down by its practitioners. Imagine a library containing centuries of knowledge, law, science, and theology, a library vaster than Alexandria, but one built not of stone and papyrus, but of human memory alone. This was the world of the Druids. This was their sacred discipline, and it is our central problem. They left us no gospels, no commandments carved in stone, no philosophical treatises. Their wisdom was a living current, passed from the lips of the master to the ears of the apprentice in the misty depths of a sacred grove. This oral tradition was their strength and their shield. It ensured that their sacred knowledge remained exclusive, potent, and safe from the profane eyes of the uninitiated and, most importantly, from the eyes of their enemies. But this strength was also their greatest vulnerability. When the masters were silenced, the library of the mind burned with them, its ashes scattered on the winds of conquest, leaving behind only echoes and riddles. So where do we begin? If we cannot listen to the Druids in their own words, we must turn to the testimony of others. We must become historical detectives, piecing together a portrait from three distinct and deeply flawed categories of evidence: the accounts of their conquerors, the myths of their descendants, and the silent, cryptic testimony of the earth itself. Each is a shard of a broken mirror, reflecting a piece of the truth, but none shows us the whole picture. To find the Druids, we must first learn to navigate this landscape of distorted reflections. Our first and most detailed body of evidence comes from an unlikely and deeply problematic source: the Romans. Their story was first written not by friends, but by their conquerors. Men like Julius Caesar, the historian Tacitus, and the encyclopedist Pliny the Elder. These are our primary eyewitnesses. But they were not neutral observers. They were soldiers, politicians, and colonial administrators, viewing Celtic society through a prism of Roman superiority, military ambition, and outright propaganda. Their writings were reports for an audience back in Rome, an audience that needed to be convinced of the necessity and righteousness of brutal foreign wars. The principal witness is none other than Gaius Julius Caesar. In his remarkable book, Commentarii de Bello Gallico, the commentaries on the Gallic War, he provides a detailed, almost ethnographic description of the Druids he encountered in Gaul, a society culturally inseparable from the one in Britain. Caesar, the brilliant general and ruthless politician, recognized the Druids for what they were: the intellectual and political glue holding Celtic society together. He paints a picture of a powerful, highly organized, and deeply respected intellectual class. He tells us they were exempt from the burdens of both warfare and taxation, privileges that made a career in their order highly desirable. He describes their function as the supreme judges of their people. They would preside over all disputes, public and private, from inheritance claims and boundary disputes to the crime of murder. Their authority was absolute. To defy a Druid's verdict was to be excommunicated from the religious rites, a punishment Caesar describes as the most severe of all. The outcast became a pariah, shunned by all, denied justice, stripped of all honor. Such was their power, Caesar claims, they could even step between two armies drawn up for battle and command peace. He details their role as the educators of the nobility, with students sometimes spending up to 20 years in training. This astonishingly long period was required to commit to memory an immense number of verses containing their knowledge of what Caesar calls natural philosophy. They studied the stars and their movements, the size of the earth and the universe, the nature of things in essence. They were the scientists, astronomers, and theologians of their world. Reading Caesar's account, one might begin to picture a noble class of philosopher kings. But then, the tone shifts. Caesar, the propagandist, takes over from Caesar, the anthropologist. He needed to portray the Gauls and Britons not as a sophisticated people with a learned priesthood, but as dangerous barbarians in desperate need of Roman civilization. And so he gives his audience in Rome the horror they expect. He describes their theology, claiming they believed that unless the life of a man is offered for the life of a man, the immortal gods will not be appeased. He speaks of their use of criminals for sacrifice, but chillingly adds that when the supply of the guilty runs short, they resort to the innocent. And then comes the single most enduring and terrifying image associated with the Druids. Caesar describes the construction of colossal effigies, their limbs woven from wicker, which were then filled with living men. The entire structure was then set ablaze, consuming its victims in a horrific offering to the gods. The Wicker Man. It's a vision of unparalleled barbarity. But we must ask the critical question: was Caesar reporting a factual common practice? Was he exaggerating a rare or localized ritual for dramatic effect? Or was he inventing a powerful horror story to justify his campaign of conquest? A story that would paint his enemies as monsters and himself as their righteous subjugator. This is the central enigma of the Roman sources. We are reading an enemy's intelligence report, not a holy book. Decades later, the historian Tacitus gives us our most dramatic narrative. The final stand of the Druids on the island of Mona, now called Anglesey, in the year 60 AD. His father-in-law, Agricola, was a high-ranking commander in Britain, so Tacitus had access to military accounts. His description is not a calm report. It is pure, adrenaline-fueled drama. Then there is Pliny the Elder, a naturalist and encyclopedist who wrote in the 1st century AD. He gives us the most famous, almost peaceful image of a Druidic rite. He describes how the Druids held nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and the oak tree on which it grows. He details a ritual occurring on the 6th day of the moon, where a priest clad in white robes would climb the sacred oak and cut the mistletoe with a golden sickle. The sacred plant was caught below in a white cloak, never allowed to touch the profane earth. This was followed by the sacrifice of 2 white bulls. It's a compelling image, but it too is an outsider's perspective, perhaps romanticized, simplified, or misunderstood. Through the Roman lens, the Druids are a paradox. They are respected philosophers and barbaric savages, a contradiction born from the necessities of empire. Our second source of evidence takes us forward in time, long after the Druids as an organized class had vanished from Britain and Gaul. We travel to the early medieval monasteries of Ireland and Wales, lands where Roman influence had been fleeting or non-existent. Here, a new intellectual class Christian monks began a monumental task. They took the great epic poems, the myths, the histories, and the genealogies that had been preserved orally for centuries, the legacy of the pre-Christian world, and committed them to parchment for the first time. Within these tales, figures who are unmistakably Druids walk the pages. But they are not as Caesar described them. In these stories, filtered through a Christian worldview, the Druid has been transformed. His priestly function is gone, replaced by the Christian priest. What remains is his power over the natural and supernatural world. He is now a wizard, a sorcerer, a prophet, a shapeshifter. In the Irish Ulster Cycle, the great epic that includes the tale of Cuchulainn, we meet the Druid Cathbad. He is a chief advisor to King Conchobar mac Nessa. He is not seen leading a public sacrifice, but he uses his powers to foretell the future. It is Cathbad who prophesies that the unborn child Deirdre will grow to be a woman of such beauty that she will bring death and ruin to the kingdom, the Deirdre of the Sorrows. He is a figure of immense power and wisdom, a kingmaker and a seer. In the Welsh tales of the Mabinogion and other medieval legends, we find proto-Merlin figures, wild prophets of the woods like Myrddin Wllt, who possess deep, esoteric knowledge. The famous magician Merlin of Arthurian legend, as we know him, is a later literary creation, but his archetype is born from these memories of the Druid. The wise, sometimes frightening, advisor to kings, who stands outside the normal bounds of society and commands the secrets of the earth. But here, too, we are looking at a reflection in a distorted mirror. These accounts were written down by monks whose entire worldview was defined by their Christian faith. For them, the pagan past was a time of darkness and error. The Druids in these tales are often cast as powerful, but ultimately misguided, antagonists to the new faith. The classic narrative is that of a Christian saint arriving in a pagan kingdom and engaging in a battle of miracles against the king's Druids. Saint Patrick's legendary confrontation with the Druids at the Hill of Tara is the ultimate example. It is a story designed to show the supremacy of the Christian God over the old magic. The power of the Druid is acknowledged, but only to make the saint's victory more impressive. So, these tales give us a precious, invaluable glimpse into how the Celtic people themselves remembered their ancient priests. They remembered them not as bloodthirsty savages, but as masters of prophecy, magic, and wisdom. But it is a memory curated and reshaped by the very faith that had supplanted them. Our third and final source of evidence has no agenda. It does not seek to justify a war or promote a faith. It is the silent testimony of the earth itself, archaeology. But if the written sources are biased, the archaeological evidence is mute. The earth offers us clues, not conclusions. We find no stone monument with the inscription Druid Temple, established 50 BC. We find no skeleton buried with a nameplate reading Archdruid of the Trinovants. What we find are patterns, anomalies, objects and bodies that hint at a belief system that matches the strange tales we have read. In our search, we are drawn to the wetland stow, the peat bogs and lakes that the Celts saw as liminal places, gateways to the other world. Here, they made their most profound offerings. At a site called Elwyn Serrig Bach, on the Isle of Anglesey, the very island Tacitus identified as the Druids' final stronghold, a stunning hoard of Iron Age metalwork was dredged from a small lake in the 1940s. Over 150 items were recovered. Swords, spearheads, shield bosses, beautiful bronze cauldrons, fragments of chariots, and even the iron slave chains used for human trafficking. These were not items that had been accidentally lost. They were deliberately, ritually broken and cast into the water over a period of centuries, priceless offerings given to the gods who dwelt in that place. We cannot prove a Druid through any single object, but we have found a major ritual site, brimming with high-status offerings, in the exact location history tells us was the heart of the Druidic order. The connection is tantalizing. Sometimes the earth gives us the bones of the people themselves. In Deal, in Kent, A warrior was buried around 200 BC in a lavish grave. He was interred with his sword and shield, but also with something unique, a remarkable crown of polished bronze, decorated but strangely plain, sitting low on his skull. It is not a king's crown in the way we might imagine. Some have speculated it is the ceremonial headdress of a priest-king, or perhaps a druid. We simply do not know. He is a mystery, a man of immense importance, buried with symbols of both temporal and, perhaps, spiritual power. And then there is the most chilling evidence of all, the bog bodies. Across northern Europe, the unique chemistry of peat bogs has preserved human remains for millennia, tanning the skin and preserving flesh in shocking detail. And some of these bodies tell a story of violent, ritualized death. The most famous is Lindau Man, discovered in a Cheshire bog in 1984. Scientific analysis revealed he was a man in his mid-20s, well-built, and had not engaged in heavy labor. He was a high-status individual. His death was anything but peaceful. He had been struck twice on the head with a heavy object. A thin cord had been used to strangle him and break his neck, and finally his throat was cut. A brutal triple death, a method of sacrifice alluded to in some ancient Irish texts. The final meal in his stomach consisted of a charred piece of griddle cake, a burnt offering, perhaps, and, crucially, traces of mistletoe pollen. Mistletoe, the most sacred plant of the Druids. Is Lindau Man the irrefutable proof of Caesar's claims? Not quite. But he is grim, physical corroboration that the kind of ritualized killing the Romans described did happen in Iron Age Britain. He closes the gap between the biased Roman text and the silent earth. Each of these pieces Caesar's self-serving commentary, a Christianized myth, a hoard of weapons from a sacred lake, the enigmatic body in the bogies, a single, flickering candle in a vast, dark room. None of them can illuminate the whole space, but together, they allow us to see the faint outlines of the ghost we are chasing. They confirm its presence. To truly understand the Druids, we must learn to see in this twilight, to piece together these scattered fragments and try to give a voice back to the silence. To the tribes of Iron Age Britain, scattered across a landscape of wild forests and windswept hills, the Druids were something far more fundamental than what we might call a priest today. They were not simply mediators for the gods, confined to a temple or a Sunday service. They were the intellectual engine of their culture, the spiritual nervous system of their people. In a world without writing, where history was a story told and law was a principle remembered, the Druids were the nation's memory, its conscience, and its living mind. Their influence was not a compartmentalized aspect of life. It was the very air their society breathed. To comprehend their role, we must set aside our modern categories. We cannot separate religion from law, or science from poetry, or philosophy from governance, because for the Druids, these were all intertwined threads in a single sacred braid of knowledge. They were the keepers of this knowledge, and in doing so, they held the keys to power, justice, and the very structure of reality as their people understood it. Let us first consider their most visible role, that of the judge. Julius Caesar, in his methodical assessment of Gallic and British society, was clearly impressed by their judicial authority. He tells us that the Druids served as the supreme arbiters in nearly all disputes, whether between tribes or between individuals. Their jurisdiction was vast, covering everything from violent crimes like murder and assault to civil matters of inheritance, property boundaries, and contractual disputes. In essence, they were the supreme court of the Celtic world. Their judgments were not merely suggestions. They were binding, backed by a spiritual power that transcended the might of any single chieftain or king. To disobey a ruling handed down by the Druids was to invite the most severe punishment imaginable in their society: excommunication. Caesar is explicit about the devastating consequences. The offender was barred from participating in the sacred sacrifices, the rituals that connected the community to the gods and ensured the world remained in balance. This act immediately rendered them impious and criminal. They became a pariah. No one would associate with them or even speak to them, for fear of being contaminated by their spiritual pollution. They were denied access to justice in any other dispute and stripped of all social standing, all honor. They became a non-person, a ghost walking among the living. This single power, the power to spiritually erase someone from their own society, was the ultimate foundation of their authority. It demonstrates that their power was not merely respected. It was deeply, fundamentally feared. This judicial function was so absolute that, according to Caesar, the Druids held the power of life and death, and could even command peace. He notes that if two armies were arrayed for battle, swords drawn and spears ready, the Druids had the authority to step between them and forbid the fight from commencing. Imagine the sheer force of personality, the depth of respect required, to stand before hundreds of armed, adrenaline-fueled warriors and, with words alone, compel them to stand down. This was the power of the Druids as keepers of law and peace. This immense authority was built upon a foundation of exclusive knowledge, and the primary role of the Druids was to protect, cultivate, and pass on this knowledge. They were the educators, the professors of the Iron Age. Their order was so prestigious, and its privileges so great, chief among them, as Caesar noted, a lifelong exemption from both military service and the payment of taxes, that many of the most ambitious young men of the nobility were sent to them for instruction. Others joined out of a genuine desire to master their arcane wisdom. But the path to becoming a Druid was not for the faint of heart. The training was a marathon of the mind, a grueling intellectual apprenticeship that could last for up to 20 years. 20 years. Let that sink in. A full 2 decades dedicated to memorization and study. This astonishingly long duration speaks volumes about the sheer quantity of information a single Druid was expected to internalize. They were to become walking libraries, their minds the carefully catalogued repositories of their entire culture. But what did this curriculum entail? What knowledge required a 20-year investment to master? Caesar tells us they learned a great number of verses and that they studied the stars and their movements, the size of the world and of the lands, the nature of things, and the might and power of the immortal gods. This was not simple religious catechism. It was a complete classical education, transmitted without a single written word. They were scientists. Their study of astronomy was not an abstract pursuit for idle stargazers. This knowledge was power. It allowed them to create and maintain the calendar, tracking the complex cycles of the sun and the moon. This dictated the sacred times for the great festivals like Samhain and Beltane, which were the pivotal moments in their year. It told farmers the right time to plant their crops and the right time to harvest them. To know the heavens was to hold the keys to the rhythm of life on earth. They were historians and genealogists. In a tribal society based on kinship, knowing your lineage was everything. It determined your status, your rights to land, your loyalties, and your obligations. The Druids memorized the vast and intricate family trees of the noble houses, tracing them back through generations. They were the keepers of the social fabric, the ones who could say definitively who belonged where. They also memorized the great myths and epic tales of their people, the stories of gods and heroes that constituted their history and defined their collective identity. They were, by some accounts, divided into a hierarchy of learning. Classical writers like Strabo mention a tripartite division of the intellectual class. At the foundation were the bards, the masters of poetry, music, and story. They were the artists, but their art was functional. Their epic poems were the vessels for history and morality. Above them were the ovates, who were the seers, diviners, and natural philosophers. They understood the secrets of the natural world, the language of omens, and perhaps medicine and herbalism. And at the apex were the Druids themselves, the philosophers and judges who oversaw the entire system, who held the deepest knowledge of theology and law. While the neatness of this division is debated, it paints a picture of a sophisticated intellectual structure, a university of the forest. And all of this, the law codes, the astronomical charts, the genealogies, the epic poems, the theological doctrines, was held in the mind alone. The prohibition against writing down their sacred lore is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of their discipline. It's easy for us in our literate world to see this as a primitive limitation. But all evidence suggests this was a deliberate, sophisticated choice. Firstly, it was a mechanism of control. By keeping their knowledge oral, they ensured it remained exclusive and potent. It could not be easily stolen, mass-produced, or misinterpreted by the unworthy. It was a sacred trust, passed only from a qualified master to a dedicated student. This secrecy amplified their power and mystique. Secondly, and perhaps more profoundly, the oral method ensured true understanding. You cannot simply skim a memorized text. To commit tens of thousands of verses to memory, to be able to recall the correct law or historical precedent at a moment's notice, requires a depth of internalization far beyond what reading can provide. The knowledge had to become a part of you, woven into the very fabric of your consciousness. It ensured that the keepers of the law didn't just know the law, they embodied the law. This practice also made their tradition a living, breathing thing. It was not a static text frozen in time, but a current of wisdom that flowed through generations, interpreted and understood anew by each mind that held it. It was a tradition that valued memory not as simple rote learning, but as the highest form of intellectual and spiritual discipline. And what was the philosophical core that underpinned all this accumulated knowledge? It was a worldview born from the forest itself. The Druids' philosophy was one of immanence, the belief that the divine was not in some distant heaven, but was present and alive in the world around them. A gnarled oak tree, a bubbling spring, a misty island, a deep cave, these were not merely features of the landscape. They were nemetons, sacred spaces, nexuses of spiritual power where the veil between this world and the other world was thin. Their very name is believed by most scholars to derive from Celtic roots meaning oak knower or oakseer druidies. The oak, strong, ancient, and life-giving, was their central symbol, a living cathedral and a gateway to the divine. This profound reverence for nature was not a romantic affectation. It was the foundation of their science, their religion, and their identity. At the very heart of their theology was a belief that stunned the Romans: the doctrine of the immortal soul. Caesar wrote that their chief teaching was that souls do not perish upon death, but pass from one body to another. Caesar, the ultimate pragmatist, saw a direct military application for this belief. He observed that it was this doctrine, above all others, which inspired courage, as it led them to hold the fear of death in contempt. A warrior who does not fear the finality of death is a formidable opponent indeed. So, the Druid was no simple shaman chanting in the woods. They were the inheritors and practitioners of a complex and demanding intellectual tradition. They were the philosopher, the scientist, the judge, the historian, and the theologian, all embodied in one figure. They were the custodians of a sacred knowledge so vast it took a lifetime to learn, a knowledge rooted in the deep green heart of the forest. They were the living mind of ancient Britain. Every faith builds a house for its god. For the Egyptians, it was a mountain of stone on the desert plain. For the Greeks, a marble palace on a high acropolis. For the Romans, a grand temple in the heart of a bustling city. These were structures designed to separate the sacred from the profane, to create a man-made space where mortals could approach the divine. The Druids, however, held a different philosophy. Their temple was not a place they built to contain the sacred. Their temple was the world itself, already built, already humming with a divine and ancient power. They did not need to construct houses for their gods because they believed their gods were already home, dwelling in the living earth, the flowing water, and the rustling leaves. To find their sanctuary, one did not enter through a carved stone gate, but by walking deeper into the woods, by listening to the whisper of the river, by standing on a windswept island where the veil between worlds felt thin. This was their hallowed ground. Our primary Roman sources are clear on this point. The historian Tacitus states that the Celts did not believe in confining their gods within walls or representing them in human form. The writer Lucan, in his epic poem Pharsalia, gives a chilling, almost Gothic, description of a sacred grove near Massilia, modern-day Marseille, that no man dared enter. He speaks of ancient, interwoven trees creating a dark, cold shadow, of altars stained with blood, and of a palpable, terrifying presence that even the local people feared. These sacred groves were known as nemetons, a Celtic word that signifies a sacred, open-air space. This was the Druids' cathedral. It was a place defined not by what was built, but by what was already there. The pillars were the living trunks of oak and yew. The roof was a shifting canopy of leaves, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the mossy floor. The only music was the chorus of the wind, the call of the raven, and the profound silence of the deep woods. The oak tree held a place of supreme importance. It was the king of the forest, a symbol of longevity, strength, and wisdom. Its deep roots drew nourishment from the earth, while its highest branches reached for the heavens, making it a natural axis between the world of mortals and the realm of the gods. It is no coincidence that the very name Druid is widely believed to mean oak knower or oak seer, Druids. Their identity was inextricably linked to this sacred tree. The Roman encyclopedist Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, provides us with our most famous and most vivid description of a specific Druidic ceremony. Though we must view it through his Roman lens, it remains a powerful image. He writes, "The Druid showed nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and the tree on which it grows, provided it be an oak." He then details the ritual with exacting precision. The ceremony would take place on the 6th day of the moon, a time of growing power. A priest, clad in pure white robes, would ascend the sacred oak. He would cut the mistletoe plant seen as a gift from heaven, growing between earth and sky not with a common iron tool, but with a golden sickle. Gold, a sacred metal, would not profane the celestial plant. Below, the precious mistletoe was not allowed to touch the profane ground, but was caught in a pure white cloak. Following this delicate harvest, 2 white bulls, whose horns had never been bound, were sacrificed. The mistletoe, Pliny tells us, was considered an all-healing remedy, a panacea for all ills. This account, whether completely accurate or partially romanticized, gives us a glimpse into the ritual theater of the Druids. The sacred colors of white and gold, the importance of astrology in timing their rites, the use of specific, symbolic tools, and the ultimate act of animal sacrifice to seal the ceremony. It places them exactly where they belong, in the heart of the sacred grove. The Druids' reverence for nature was not confined to the forests. They were also drawn to water. Rivers, springs, bogs, and lakes were seen as liminal spaces, thresholds between the physical world and the other world, the realm of spirits and deities. Water gives life, but it also has a mysterious depth. Its surface reflects our world, but beneath lies a hidden, unseen realm. To the Celtic mind, these places were portals, and the gods who lived within them demanded respect and offerings. This belief gave rise to one of the most archaeologically visible practices of the Iron Age, the ritual deposition of votive offerings in water. For centuries, People would travel to these sacred sites and cast their most valuable possessions into the depths as gifts for the gods. These were not casual losses. They were deliberate, expensive acts of faith. Often, the objects were ritually killed before being offered. Swords were bent, shields were broken, spears were snapped. This act may have been to release the object's spirit, or to ensure no mortal could ever use it again, making the sacrifice permanent and irreversible. The most spectacular evidence for this practice comes from a place we have already mentioned, a place history tells us was the very epicenter of Druidic power, the island of Mona or Anglesey. In 1943, during the construction of a Royal Air Force base, dredging machines began pulling astonishing objects from the mud of a small lake called Lyn Serrig Bach. What they uncovered was one of the most important Iron Age hoards ever found in Britain. Over 150 objects were recovered. There were magnificent bronze and iron swords, some still in their decorated scabbards. There were spearheads, fragments of shields, beautiful cauldrons used for feasting, ornate bronze trumpets, and parts from at least 5 chariots. Most chillingly, there were iron gang chains designed to hold multiple captives by the neck. These were not the everyday tools of farmers. This was the wealth of a warrior aristocracy, offered to the gods of the lake over a period of several hundred years. Given that the Roman historian Tacitus specifically identifies Mona as the final, bloody sanctuary of the British Druids, it is almost impossible not to see Lyn Serrig Bach as a major national shrine, presided over by the Druidic order. The objects found there are a direct, physical echo of their authority and their religious practices. The slave chains are a grim reminder of the brutality of the era, while the sacrificed weapons and chariots speak to a warrior culture seeking divine favor through profound acts of piety. We are looking at the material evidence of the beliefs the Druids guided. And then there are the stones. There is no image more firmly lodged in the popular imagination of the Druid than that of a white-robed figure, arms outstretched, celebrating the midsummer sunrise within the great circle of Stonehenge. It is a powerful, romantic, and enduring vision. It is also almost certainly incorrect. This is perhaps the greatest misunderstanding in the entire story of the Druids. The great megalithic monuments of Britain, Stonehenge, Avebury, and hundreds of other stone circles, standing stones, and chambered tombs were not built by the Iron Age Druids. The archaeological timeline is unequivocal. The main phases of construction at Stonehenge occurred during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, roughly between 300 and 1500 BC. The Druids, as described by Caesar and other classical authors, were the priesthood of the Iron Age Celts, a culture that flourished more than 1,000 years after the last great stone was raised at Stonehenge. There is no archaeological evidence connecting the historical Druids to the construction or primary use of these megalithic sites. The Romans, our only contemporary eyewitnesses, speak only of them worshipping in sacred groves. So where did this potent but mistaken connection come from? It was born much later, in the 17th and 18th centuries, during a period of renewed fascination with Britain's ancient past. Antiquarians like John Aubrey and later William Stukeley were the first to survey these magnificent ruins with a scientific eye. Faced with these incredible, mysterious structures, and knowing from classical texts that Britain's ancient priesthood was the Druids, they made a logical but flawed leap of faith. They concluded that these barbarous temples must have been built by the barbarous priests. Stukeley, in particular, became obsessed with the idea, publishing extensive books with detailed illustrations of Druids presiding over Stonehenge. His ideas were so influential that they cemented the connection in the public mind, a connection that has persisted for 300 years. But does this mean the stones were irrelevant to the historical Druids? Perhaps not. To dismiss any connection at all may be to oversimplify. Imagine being a member of an intellectual class obsessed with astronomy, the cycles of the sun and moon, and the measurement of the seasons. And in your landscape stand these colossal, ancient observatories, built by your ancestors, their stones perfectly aligned to the very solstices you hold sacred. Is it conceivable that you would simply ignore them? It seems far more plausible that the Druids would have recognized the power and purpose of these ancient places. While they may not have been their primary temples, which were the groves, it is likely they revered the stone circles as places of immense ancestral power. They may have incorporated them into their sacred geography, visiting them at auspicious times to observe the celestial alignments that their own ancestors had so brilliantly captured in stone. They were not the builders, but they may well have been the inheritors of the knowledge and reverence that these sites represented. But of all the hallowed ground, one place stood above all others as the heartland of the British Druids. It was not a single grove or a single lake, but an entire island, Mona, a bastion off the coast of North Wales. For Tacitus, it was the nerve center of the resistance, a place that gave sanctuary to fugitives, and was a stronghold for their savage rights. It was here that the intellectual, spiritual, and military opposition to Rome was concentrated. The archaeological evidence of Lyn Serigbach confirms its status as a place of profound religious importance. Mona was their university, their sanctuary, and their fortress. It was the most sacred ground, the symbolic heart of their entire order. And it was for this very reason that the Roman eagle would eventually turn its eyes upon it, determined to tear that heart out. It was on this hallowed ground that the Druids would make their final stand, and the sacred groves would be watered with their own blood. At the heart of every religion lies a conception of what comes after. For the Druids, this was not a place of final judgment, but a cyclical journey. Their belief in the transmigration of the soul shaped their entire worldview. Life and death were two sides of the same coin. Philostratus of Tyana, a Greek writer, claimed the Celts believed that to be born into this world, one must die in the other world, and when we die here, we are born there. This other world was not a distant, ethereal heaven, but a parallel reality, ever-present and sometimes accessible to the living through altered states of consciousness like trances or deep meditation. It was a land of myth and magic, inhabited by gods, spirits, and the ancestors. Their lives were governed by the turning wheel of the year, a cycle of festivals that marked the changing seasons and brought them closer to the other world. There were 4 great fire festivals. Samhain on the 31st of October was the most significant. It marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of the dark half of the year. On this night, the barrier between the world of the living and the other world was at its thinnest, allowing spirits and ancestors to walk among mortals. It was a time of divination and remembrance, the ancient precursor to our modern Halloween. Beltane, on the 30th of April, celebrated the coming of summer, light, and fertility. Livestock were driven between 2 great bonfires to purify and protect them. Imbolc in early February and Lugnasa in August marked other key points in the agricultural and spiritual calendar, each a time for specific rituals to ensure the continued balance between humanity, the land, and the gods. But this communion with the divine had a darker, more terrifying side, one that chilled the blood of the Romans and has haunted the legacy of the Druids ever since: human sacrifice. Our Roman sources are unflinching in their accusations. Caesar claims the Druids believed that the life of a man was the only fitting offering to appease the gods for the life of another man. He states they would sacrifice criminals, but if the supply ran short, they would not hesitate to use the innocent. His most infamous description is of vast wickerwork figures, filled with living men, which were then set ablaze, a horrifying holocaust in honor of their gods. Other writers, like Diodorus Siculus, describe different methods of divination through death. He speaks of a victim being stabbed above the diaphragm. The Druids then foretelling the future from the manner of their fall, the convulsing of their limbs, and the gushing of their blood. It is a gruesome and disturbing image. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed by many as mere propaganda, the slanders of an imperial power. But archaeological discoveries have forced a grim reconsideration. The bog bodies of northern Europe, human remains preserved for millennia in the anaerobic conditions of peat bogs, provide chilling physical evidence. Lindau Man, found in a Cheshire bog, was a high-status individual in his mid-20s. He had been bludgeoned, his throat was slit, and a cord was tightened around his neck. 26. It was a triple killing, a method of sacrifice sometimes described in ancient texts. In his stomach were the charred remnants of a griddle cake and, crucially, mistletoe paulina plant quintessentially linked to the Druids. Was he a criminal, a captive, or a willing sacrifice? Was this an act of the Druids? The evidence is circumstantial, but powerfully suggestive. In the war sanctuaries of Iron Age France, archaeologists have found graphic evidence of mass killings, likely of prisoners of war, their bodies displayed as offerings. While the link to Druids isn't definitive, it proves that large-scale ritual killing was a part of the culture they spiritually guided. We must be cautious. The Romans had every reason to portray their enemies as monstrous. But we also cannot ignore the growing archaeological record. It suggests that while the Wicker Man may have been an exaggeration or a localized practice, the reality of ritual killing in Iron Age Britain was all too real. It was a dark and violent world, and the Druids, as its spiritual leaders, would have presided over its darkest rites, mediating not just with words and prayers, but with blood. When the Roman legions landed in Britain in 43 AD, it was not merely a clash of armies. It was a collision of worlds, a conflict between two profoundly different ideologies. And for the Romans, one group embodied the heart of the native resistance more than any other: the Druids. Rome was generally tolerant of the religions of conquered peoples, often assimilating foreign gods into its own pantheon. But the Druids were different. The Romans saw them not just as priests, but as a dangerous political force. They were the glue that held the often fractious British tribes together, the ideological backbone of Celtic identity and defiance. Their authority over the chieftains, their power to unify disparate groups against the invaders, made them a direct threat to Roman imperial ambitions. Furthermore, their practices, particularly the persistent rumors of human sacrifice, were seen by the Romans as fundamentally barbaric and antithetical to Roman civilization. Emperors Tiberius and Claudius passed laws actively suppressing the Druids, banning their rights and stripping them of their power. It was a systematic campaign to decapitate the Celtic intellectual and spiritual leadership. The conflict reached its terrifying climax in the year 60 AD, on the shores of the Isle of Mona or Anglesey. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, a ruthless and efficient general, decided to strike at the very heart of the Druidic order. The Roman historian Tacitus, in a passage of breathtaking drama, describes the scene that confronted the Roman soldiers as their flat-bottomed boats approached the island. On the beach stood a formidable array of British warriors. But moving among them, like furies from a nightmare, were women in black, with disheveled hair, brandishing torches and shrieking curses. And at the center of it all stood the Druids, their hands raised to the heavens, calling down dreadful imprecations upon the heads of the invaders. Tacitus writes that the sight was so unnerving that the Roman soldiers were, for a moment, frozen in their tracks, as if paralyzed, presenting their motionless bodies to the enemy's blows. It was their officers who rallied them, urging them not to be frightened by a cohort of fanatics and crazed women. The legions charged. The battle was a massacre. The Roman war machine crashed down upon the defenders, slaughtering them without mercy. But Suetonius Paulinus was not content with mere victory. He was there to eradicate a belief system. He ordered his men to cut down the sacred groves of Mona, which Tacitus describes as being dedicated to inhuman superstitions and drenched with the blood of prisoners. The altars were smashed, the sacred trees felled, and the Druids themselves, according to Tacitus, were thrown onto the fires they had prepared for their Roman captives. The fall of Mona was a devastating blow, both physically and symbolically. It was the destruction of the Druids' most sacred sanctuary, their university, and their center of resistance. Although the campaign was cut short when Suetonius had to race back to southern Britain to crush the massive rebellion of Boudica, a revolt likely incited and spiritually fueled by the Druids themselves, the damage was done. In the decades that followed, Romanization spread. Roman law replaced tribal custom, Roman gods were worshipped in newly built temples, and the Latin language eroded the Celtic tongue in matters of administration. The social and political structures that had given the Druids their power crumbled. Without their authority, without their sacred sites, and with their oral traditions broken, the Druids began to fade into the shadows of history, their power extinguished by the eagle's shadow. What happens when a culture's intellectual and spiritual leaders are systematically destroyed? Do they vanish without a trace? Or does their knowledge seep into the soil, nurturing new growths in unexpected forms? The destruction of the Druids by the Romans was not a clean surgical strike. It was a messy, brutal process that left behind a profound cultural vacuum. But the spirit of the Druids did not die entirely on the shores of Mona. It retreated, transformed, and endured in the whispers of myth and the fabric of a new religion. In the parts of the Celtic world least touched by Roman rule, especially Ireland, the Druidic class survived, but their role changed. With the arrival of Christianity in the 5th century, a new power arose. The old priests could not compete with the organizational strength and state-sponsored backing of the Church. Over time, their priestly functions were stripped away. They were no longer the primary mediators between humanity and the divine. Yet, their knowledge was too valuable to discard completely. The learned lineages of the Druids fragmented and evolved into new, secular roles. The Philid, a class of high-ranking poets and historians, inherited the Druidic mantle of preserving genealogies and tribal lore. The Braithimhain, or Brehons, became the keepers of the intricate system of native Irish law. They were no longer priests, but they remained the intellectual elite, the inheritors of a tradition of deep learning. In the popular imagination and in the myths recorded by Christian monks, the figure of the Druid was transformed into something else. A magician, a sorcerer, a powerful but often sinister figure from a bygone age. They are the shadowy advisors to pagan kings, capable of great prophecies and terrible curses, but always destined to be overcome by the power of the Christian saints. St. Patrick's legendary confrontation with the High King's Druids at Tara is a prime example of this narrativia battle of faiths, where the old magic must yield to the new. But perhaps the most famous echo of the Druid is found in the legends of Britain itself, in the archetypal figure of Merlin. While the Merlin of Arthurian romance is a later literary creation, his roots lie in older Welsh legends of a wild prophet and magician named Myrddin. This figure embodies many of the key functions of a druid. He is a seer who can read the future, an advisor to kings, a shapeshifter, and a master of nature's secrets. He is the memory of the druid, transformed into a single iconic wizard. Even the symbols and beliefs may have been absorbed. The deep Celtic reverence for the number 3, a cornerstone of Druidic thought, found a new home in the Christian concept of the Holy Trinity. The veneration of sacred wells and springs continued, but they were now rededicated to Christian saints. The timing of ancient pagan festivals was co-opted, with Christmas placed near the winter solstice and Easter near the spring equinox. It was a process of assimilation, where the new faith laid a veneer over the ancient foundations. The legacy of the Druids is therefore a subtle and complex one. They left no monuments in their own name, but their influence can be felt in the rich tapestry of Irish and Welsh mythology, in the structure of ancient law codes, and in the enduring folk traditions of the British Isles. They became ghosts in their own land, but ghosts that continued to speak, their whispers shaping the culture that had replaced them for centuries to come. For over 1,000 years, the Druids belonged to the past. They were figures of history and myth, studied by scholars and romanticized by poets. But in the 18th century, something remarkable happened. Amid the intellectual fervor of the Romantic movement, a fascination with Britain's ancient past took hold, and the Druids were reborn. This was the beginning of Neo-Druidry, or modern Druidism. It began with the work of antiquarians like William Stukeley, who, despite mistakenly linking the Druids to Stonehenge, imbued them with an aura of being noble, proto-Christian philosophers of nature. Others, like the Welshman Iolo Morganwg, went even further, fabricating rituals and philosophical texts which he claimed were survivals from the ancient order. Though his work was largely invented, it sparked a cultural revival in Wales and helped to found organizations like the Gorsedd of Bards, which continues to this day. These early revival groups were often fraternal and cultural, modeled on Freemasonry, using the romantic figure of the Druid as a symbol of Britain's indigenous spirituality. They were a far cry from the Iron Age priesthood they sought to emulate. But as the 20th century progressed, and particularly from the 1960s onwards, modern Druidry evolved into a genuine spiritual path. It became part of the wider modern pagan movement, attracting people who felt disconnected from mainstream religion and longed for a faith rooted in nature and ancestral heritage. Modern Druids are a diverse group. Some are polytheists, revering the ancient Celtic gods and goddesses. Some are monotheists, seeing a single divine spirit in nature. Others are animists or pantheists, experiencing the divine as present in all things. What unites them is not a strict dogma, but a shared set of values, a profound reverence for the natural world, a respect for the ancestors, and a quest for Áine Welsh word for divine inspiration or creative flow. Modern Druid practice often involves celebrating the eightfold wheel of the year, with gatherings at the solstices and equinoxes, often held at ancient sites. While fully aware that their ancient namesakes did not build Stonehenge, many modern Druids feel a powerful connection to these places, seeing them as sacred centers where they can connect with the land and the ancestors. It is crucial to understand that modern Druidry is not a direct, unbroken continuation of the ancient faith. Too much was lost. Instead, it is a creative and heartfelt reconstruction, a modern spiritual path that draws inspiration from the ancient sources, from folklore, from mythology, and above all, from the living landscape of Britain itself. It separates itself from the more brutal aspects of the past. There are no sacrifices, only offerings of song, poetry, and respect. Some modern Druidic paths, often called Celtic Reconstructionist, strive for greater historical accuracy, meticulously researching archaeological and textual evidence to rebuild the ancient practices as faithfully as possible. Others, like the popular order of bards, ovates, and druids, blend ancient inspiration with modern psychology and personal development. In a world facing ecological crisis, the Druids' ancient reverence for the earth feels more relevant than ever. Their legacy, once buried by Roman conquest and veiled by centuries of silence, has found a new voice. It proves that even when a culture's library is burned, its spirit can endure, its seeds lying dormant, waiting for the right season to grow again. The Druids remain figures of profound mystery. They are a people defined as much by the questions they leave behind as by the answers we can find. Were they noble philosophers or barbaric priests? peaceful arbitrators, or the architects of human sacrifice. The truth, as is so often the case, likely lies somewhere in the complex and contradictory space between. They were the soul of Celtic Britain, a class of revered intellectuals who held law, science, history, and faith within their formidable memories. They understood the cycles of the cosmos and the secrets of the earth. Their power was so great that the Roman Empire, the mightiest military force of the age, saw them as a fundamental threat that had to be extinguished with fire and sword. Their story is a powerful reminder of how history is written by the victors, and how an entire worldview can be lost when its oral traditions are silenced. We are left to sift through the propaganda of their enemies, the romanticized legends of their descendants, and the enigmatic clues buried in the ground, forever trying to piece together a puzzle whose most important pieces are missing. They are an echo in the landscape, a whisper in the rustling of an ancient oak, a ghost on the misty shores of Anglesey, and their secrets, though veiled, continue to call to us from across the millennia, inviting us to look deeper into the shadows of the past. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of the ancient Druids. If you found this exploration of the past enlightening, please consider subscribing to Driftwood Histories and tapping the bell icon to be notified of our future investigations. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of the Druids do you find most fascinating? Until next time, keep digging into the past.